My father was a tireless advocate for the law. He was a criminal prosecutor. Some say ruthless, others say righteous. Yeah, I'm cut from the same cloth. I can't really remember who I was before I became a cop. It's my job to make bad things happen to bad people.
I knew that she put up a fight. She was fighting because she wanted to be in my life.
Maybe she was being controlled by certain individuals to lead that type of lifestyle. I was surprised that's what life came to after she was with me.
I miss her so much. She meant everything.
I always carry that little bit of guilt about not being there for her when it happened, because that was her husband. Maybe I shouldn't have left her.
I'll always have this void in me, and I don't think anything will be able to ever heal that.
I can't imagine what it's like not to have a mother.
I've been waiting for years and years for this man to be caught.
Tell me how you and Nadine met.
Me and Nadine met in Montego Bay, Jamaica in 1990. Relationship developed after that, and then I married her. She came here in 1992, Nadine, up to Canada. When we found out Nadine was pregnant, everybody was happy. It was a great time. I would say Heather would be about a year old before things started to fall apart. She wanted to move to the Jamaican community.
Beyond that, you had no idea what she was up to, who she was with, what she was doing.
I had no idea of anything. I was surprised that she didn't try contacting her daughter at all.
In meeting Paul and Heather today, we're hoping to get a better sense of who Nadine was. There's so many unanswered questions.
So, Heather, I'd like to ask you about your mom.
I remember feeling where is she? I didn't know what it was like to have a woman to talk to. It was pretty hard growing up.
She's so sweet and so broken. Nobody can replace your mother, and it's just that much more brutal to now see what this has done to people.
What I want is just for justice, her murderer to be caught, and it's just been a horrible journey.
It's been 14 years. We've been waiting for somebody to, really take this serious.
It's our hope that we can start to bring the resolutions that you're both seeking. It's overdue.
Huge overdue.
Paul and Heather both know there's elevated stakes in this case. They're both clinging to some very idyllic, very happy memories of Nadine. This case may turn over stones that they don't want turned over, but it needs to be done. I've been a cop and a professor of criminology for years, and I've used that experience to assemble a squad of civilian subject matter experts. They must approach each case completely unbiased, to not box themselves into conventional thinking, to bring fresh eyes and new technologies to the table. Their job, and mine, is to investigate the coldest of cold cases, the murders that time forgot. This is Victoria Street in the town of Vineland. On May 8th, 1999, two cyclists make a grim discovery of an adult female, partially clothed, black, 5'4", roughly 130 pounds, painted toes and fingernails. Bodies found at the bottom of this slight depression, out of sight from the rope. Beyond that, nothing is known.
I feel sadness that somebody would toss you on the street. That makes me sad about people.
Check of fingerprints on the local database, as well as against immigration records, missing persons databases, all came back negative. For weeks, she remains a Jane Doe. Police took the unusual step of releasing to the press an image of the victim's face taken in the morgue.
You don't see a morgue photo too often. I don't believe I've ever seen one.
This is where it's tough for a civilian squad like this. And this is the first case where they've seen our victim after they've been killed.
What rattled me more was seeing how upset Antonella was. That got me.
The fact that she remained a Jane Doe for 3 weeks breaks my heart. Nadine was somebody that lost her way, and nobody was looking out for her.
But ultimately, it was this unusual technique that finally led to the victim being identified as Naen Ginski. Original file number 99-421-25. Cause of death was determined to be a combination of a broken neck and severe internal injuries. No sign of sexual assault. There is offender DNA in this case.
Mike, what more do we know about Nadine?
We actually know very little. By mid-96, she was separated from her husband, Paul, and to make ends meet was working as a dancer in the area's adult entertainment industry.
The fact that she was estranged from her husband and her child, I find that unusual for a mom. So I'm wondering if something happened in her life that would have caused her to veer in another direction.
We know that she was last seen alive, leaving a striptease establishment known as Maryland's in Mississauga. That was the evening of May 6th, 99, leaving in the company of a man.
Is there a composite sketch?
There is. Police circulated a composite sketch of the man, some described as maybe her boyfriend.
And no one reported her missing either.
And no one reported her missing.
Or did it ever come up whether or not she did escort work or anything like that on the side?
There's no evidence of that.
I managed a club for a year. In that world, there does tend to be, I think, a much higher chance of someone being addicted to drugs, being involved in violence.
The fact that her body was found in a ditch on a highway likely means that she was driven or dumped.
Right, the use of a vehicle suggests she was killed elsewhere.
What's unusual that she had no clothes on except stockings, but no sexual assault?
By definition, it is a sexual assault. Removing clothing is an unwanted assault of a sexual nature. This case really marks a departure for this squad in terms of victimology, of the institutions that they're going to be interacting with. We don't have the usual network of people who can help. This is going to be a challenge for the squad. All right, moving on to avenues of investigation. Renee, is there a particular importance to where Nadine's body was dumped? Dania, I'm going to pair you up with Monty, dig into Nadine's background in this industry.
There is danger for sure. So that's kind of scary in and of itself. I'm glad I'm going with Monty.
Antonella, we know that adult industry dancers are predisposed statistically to a certain number of crimes. Dig into the psychological profile of not only the killer, but of Nadine. Nadine has a daughter who can't remember her mother. So if for no other reason, to get to the bottom of this case for her, let's be safe, let's be smart, let's get out there and start thawing this case out. We have all these loose threads, where the body was found, the state the body was found in.
When people say that these dancers choose out of their own free will to enter this profession, there was nothing consensual about Nadine being found in a ditch.
We're gonna actually have to go to the strip clubs, a world society typically shuns.
There is an element of danger, and it rears its ugly head every once in a while.
The squad is looking into the 1999 murder of Naen Ginski. At the time of her death, Nadine was separated from her husband, Paul, and working as an exotic dancer when her naked body was discovered in a ditch in Niagara's wine country. I've asked Peter and Renee to go to the scene, and looking at that landscape, I want them to determine whether this was a crime of opportunity committed by somebody passing through, or whether this was, in fact, a murder committed by somebody who knew the area.
Renee and I have come to Victoria Avenue and 8th. This is the general location where Nadine's body was discovered in 1999. This pole has the sign updated.
Perspective-wise, we're in the right spot. If you look at this photograph, I don't think they had a turn lane before. This might just be a wide shoulder.
No turn lane means plenty of paved shoulder to stop a vehicle at.
The accessibility by road, how concealed her body would have been, it makes sense as a dump site. So Peter,
Yeah.
just while I was taking some photographs, I was trying to look for potential witnesses. And my best bet so far is those buildings over there. Well, there seems to be a sight line to the area where Nadine's body was found.
It's an unsolved murder.
Just a body found just up the street here on 8th in the ditch.
In 1999, would the traffic patterns be fairly similar?
Traffic has always been busy on this road, on Victoria.
Okay. They did circulate a photograph of a person of interest to the police at the time. Does this face look familiar to you at all?
I don't recognize him, no.
Okay. Richard's grown up in this area. You would think in such a small community a murder would be a big deal, and it very clearly isn't, which to me may be attributable to the lifestyle of the victim. So perhaps one of the reasons that there were no witnesses or so few leads developed is because these girls didn't get the publicity that they should have.
I do remember there's a few other instances like it around this area. I believe Nadine was on 8th, and the other one, I don't remember her name, but she was on 7th.
How far apart were those two murders?
That one would have been around 2005, 2006.
Seems like quite a quaint, small town, so it's surprising to me that there are other bodies found nearby. That's something that we'll have to look into, the pattern and timing of the other murders and how those bodies were left.
It's very early in the investigation, so I'm starting from scratch, looking online at newspaper reports. I came across something that said that Paul and Nadine were only days away from getting a divorce. Kind of makes me wonder if he was ever considered a suspect.
I'm meeting with Christine. She was Paul's girlfriend at the time that Nadine was murdered. I want to talk to her to get a better idea of who Nadine was and what her relationship with Paul was at the time. In terms of Paul bringing Nadine over from Jamaica, what do you know about that?
He wanted to give her a better life. When Paul told me the story of how he had met Nadine and brought her to Canada in '92, and how as soon as she got here, she didn't really want to stay. They were kind of like an oil and water mix. Paul would tell me that Nadine would strike him. He wouldn't hit her, but she would hit him. She had actually called the police to try to get Paul in trouble.
I was really surprised to hear the level of violence that was in the marriage, the volatility in that marriage.
I got the impression that Nadine just used Paul to get here. She wanted to go to Toronto. Paul didn't want to leave Niagara because his family was all based here. She took Heather to Toronto with her, and Paul fought for custody. Paul was eventually awarded full custody of Heather. I actually went to the courthouse and they said there was no custody order. The court process had never been finalized. Paul was concerned that Nadine could have come even to her school and taken her. And Paul legally would not have had any status to get his child back.
Talking to Christine has given me some really good information to go with. From my experience as a psychotherapist, I know that the fear of having a child taken from you can make people do drastic things they wouldn't normally consider. I wonder how much these things played on Paul's mind.
Richard at the auto shop mentioned a second body discovered not far from where Nadine was found.
I found that address for the second body. I'm going to send you the information so you can plot it on the map.
Send away. Seventh Avenue, that's correct?
You'll notice it's really, really close by.
So I'm going to plot this together with Nadine's recovery site. 889 meters. That's the distance.
I'm going to see if I can find out about any other victims or any other crime that took place in this area. Could lead us to an interesting pattern.
Get a look at this.
What have you got?
Nadine's body was found 55 miles from where she was last seen alive. But what's really striking here, I've plotted the distance from these bodies to Paul Grzinski's place that they both dumped 11.5 miles from Paul's home.
It was very surprising to hear that Nadine and a second victim were so close to Paul's home. This is rather significant because any other landmarks that seem to be relevant to this case in Nadine's life are much further away. Can that even be a coincidence?
The squad is looking to help determine who murdered exotic dancer Naen Ginski in 1999. I've asked them to explore all possible avenues: transients, truckers, johns, and pimps. Antonella has discovered that Nadine's estranged husband, Paul, was afraid that she was going to try to take their daughter, Heather, away from him. Further to this, both Peter and Renee have discovered a second victim disposed of in the same area and in similar circumstances, both 11.5 miles from Paul's house. I need to speak further with Paul. Was he ever evaluated or considered a suspect? When's the last time you had any contact, direct or indirect, with a police investigator?
Oh, with an investigator? Yeah. A couple of years ago, we hired psychics, and the detectives came and they followed every lead.
Do you remember what some of those were?
They were looking for a truck driver, somebody with a bite mark on them, stuff like that.
Given what you knew about Nadine, how would she have ended up in a car with somebody or in a situation with somebody who could have done this to her?
She would have gotten in a car with a complete stranger. She had the feeling like nobody was going to harm her. I don't think there was a fear there.
If things went bad, what would she have done?
She would have fought, for sure. I know she was a strong woman. Like, not just strong, but strong.
How did you first receive word about what happened?
I got a phone call from my mother saying that there's 2 detectives at the house and they want to speak with you.
Presumably after the identification, there was a line of questioning.
They asked me where I was on such and such a day. And then I told them I have no idea. I couldn't remember. And asked me if I knew the last whereabouts where Nadine lived and stuff like that.
So in a roundabout way, they're telling you that you were initially interviewed as a suspect. I'm not surprised that the police questioned Paul quite pointedly following Nadine's death. He was her estranged ex-husband. Her body was found near where Paul was living at the time. And in fact, they proceeded to an interrogation, it sounds like, very quickly after notifying him of her death. And are geographically profiling her final movements. She's residing in Toronto. At that time is a dancer in Mississauga and is found in Niagara region. If you triangulate those 3 locations, it's unusual.
I thought maybe she was working here too.
Would she have kept a second apartment, maybe just renting a room somewhere nearby?
I thought the police said that she had an apartment here in St. Catharines.
The revelation that Nadine was probably working around here and may have also had an apartment nearby could certainly explain why her body was recovered so close to Paul's house. Either way, we'll need to verify that information. Take us through the first hours of the original investigation.
They went and took DNA from me.
Did they tell you why?
I can't remember.
Did they tell you they took yours to exclude you?
I don't think they said one way or another.
Did they ever formally then tell you, we've cleared you?
I don't think they ever said that.
It's not uncommon for police to not necessarily call back every single person involved in what's known as a DNA sweep. In Paul's case, over 15 years later, he would know by now if there was a match, and the fact this case is still open confirms that he is cleared by DNA. We'll need to verify that information. I've got Monty and Dania checking at the clubs where Nadine was working at the time of her death. I like the male-female pairing considering where they're going. There may be a lot of people in this industry who will talk to one and not the other. By putting them together, you really enhance the best characteristics of both.
Maryland Strip Club was actually the last place that Nadine was seen leaving, which was her place of work.
See if we can find anyone who remembers her, maybe pick up a lead there and run with it.
Well, it's obviously not here anymore, but perhaps we can go canvass some other strip clubs.
Have you ever been to a strip club before?
I have, so I know what to expect.
A lot of the dancers, they tend to move around. It's most probable that she danced at other clubs.
It looks like it's going to be busy.
Thursday's a good night for these clubs.
Whatever I can do to get the answers is what I'm going to go forward doing. But there's a little bit of a fear.
26 at a time of Jamaican descent.
She was actually found up in Niagara.
We haven't found anyone as yet that knew Nadine personally. However, we've been set up to contact some older dancers and older servers who may have known her. Definitely a worthwhile night. Definitely going to have to come back, push harder, and try and get some solid, concrete results.
Preliminary action items. Antonella, let's start with you.
I was tasked to research findings on men that frequent strip clubs. The research that I do have was based on a study conducted by a former stripper. Now, she was a stripper for 13 years. Now she's a district attorney. What I found was quite disturbing. These men will not only attend the strip club, but they will also follow them in their private lives. They'll go to their homes, they'll go to the fitness clubs, they will follow them to the daycare. They've even had guys break into their homes and take underwear and family photographs.
It sounds like what are known as stranger obsessional stalkers. So someone who has and develops an imagined relationship with an acquaintance or usually a stranger and has a fantasy-based relationship with this person.
In the adult entertainment world, the overwhelming majority of the clientele don't cause any problems. Sure, there's some creepy people that go there, but that could be said about anything, perhaps a slightly higher percentage.
Renee, you were going to look at similar victims.
In only a 10-year span, I've identified at least 7 other women who had similar high-risk lifestyle characteristics to Nadine, who have been murdered and their bodies disposed of in this Niagara region.
Over a 10-year period, Nadine plus at least 7 others, all with similarities in terms of victimology and at-risk lifestyles.
Correct.
As I hear stats like that, and I think of cases like the Highway of Tears and Robert Picton's victims. Robert Picton is the former British Columbia pig farmer, now serving a life sentence for the murder of 7 women. He confessed to a cellmate, who was actually an undercover police officer, that he had murdered 49 women. And you can't help but think serial. Renee's uncovered this cluster of unsolved killings.
You think the worst case scenario.
This may just be the tip of the iceberg. Squad and I are examining the unsolved 1999 murder of Naen Ginski, an exotic dancer whose body was dumped in a ditch in the Niagara region. While they're not professional detectives by trade, the squad has been working hard to unearth new leads, and they've discovered that Nadine's estranged husband, Paul, had his DNA taken by police during the early stages of the investigation. I, in turn, have confirmed that through DNA, Paul was eliminated as a suspect in Nadine's death. Also, Renee's research has confirmed that several other women were murdered and their bodies dumped in that same region during that same period.
We need to determine if their similarities point to a common perpetrator or whether it's just a very sad coincidence.
Renee, I'd like to hear more about these other 8 women. What do you have?
First is Dawn Stewart, 1996, Susan Gorley in 2001, Felicia Floriani. She went missing in 2002 but wasn't found until 2012. Kimlin Tolges in 2002 as well. Margaret Jugaro in 2004.
These people had families. These people mattered to someone. To see them all together is very disturbing and very sad.
Going to the strip clubs and then seeing these women who've gone missing or have been murdered, it's eerie.
Diane Dimitri and Casey Chikaki were both killed by Michael Durant, although he's appealed the 2 convictions. Now, he was convicted recently, so his DNA would be in the databank.
His DNA, in fact, would have been taken immediately upon conviction, and then within 24 hours compared to the crime scene index. Any outstanding unsolveds where DNA is on file would have already been matched to him. So if he hasn't been matched already, we can take him off the table. We need to confirm as soon as possible whether there are any similarities between these remaining 5 and see who we can screen in and who we can definitively screen out as unrelated. Peter, I'd like you to take what Renee's already found and populate a geoprofile. So let's see if visually the data can tell us something new, okay? Monty and Antonella, focus specifically on Nadine. Find more people who knew her. We need to start putting these pieces of her life during those final months and years together.
There's a truck stop directly south of the club where we confirmed Nadine danced and other girls knew her there. I want to canvass that place.
Truck stops have often their own culture, their own regulars. They may remember somebody who stuck out, somebody who frequented that club. These wine country deaths seem to be along tourist routes, shipping routes, so you may be onto something there. Mobility and travel routes during the final hours of Nadine's life are especially important in this case. We know she was last seen leaving the club with this person of interest depicted in the composite, and we know that her body ended up in wine country some distance away. Lots of work to do, but I like what I'm hearing so far. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between Nadine's killing and these other killings. This can't be dismissed as a coincidence. Bodies in the ditch warrants, it demands a closer look.
Nadine's body was found in Vineland an hour and a half from where she was last seen. So obviously, someone with wheels. There's a lot of people that hang around truck stops looking for rides. They call them lot lizards. They have no idea who they're getting in a truck with. And I just wonder if there was any drivers that were known for picking up women and targeting them specifically. Does that look familiar to you, that person there?
Not really.
Okay. Perhaps you can help me.
What's up?
Investigating a murder that occurred in 1999. And she was last seen leaving a club, Maryland's, not far from here. Most of the people I've canvassed and spoken to weren't around in 1999. One of the servers told me there's a fella who drives dancers around all from club to club to club, and I've left my phone number. Perhaps he'll contact me.
Mike Napier is a retired behavioral scientist with the FBI. In fact, he was brought in as a consultant during the early days of Nadine's investigation when she was still a Jane Doe. If I'll just turn your mind back to Nadine's case, what did you make of the fractured neck?
There are some indications that this could very well be an escalated situation. It didn't start out as intent to cause her death. There are indications that she was volatile, that she would say things inappropriate, but that could trigger great emotion from the person she's with, which leads to some assault on her. Obviously, he wants to hurt her. He wants her to feel the pain.
You don't see most of the elements that typically accompany a sexual homicide. There's no sexual intrusion, damage to the face.
When you're examining behavior, one of the things you want to look at is what's not there. The aspect of no damage to the face, for example, could suggest that there's a relationship between the offender and the victim, and that he protected the face because that's earning power. And if he is in a position to be sharing her money, her proceeds, then he doesn't want to damage it. The lack of damage tells us that that's intentional.
Nadine's death was likely the result of an escalated dispute, whether a verbal argument or a physical confrontation stemming from some sort of sexual encounter gone south. Either a rejection or a dysfunction. Either way, this is some indicator of the offender and Nadine having some kind of relationship.
After getting absolutely nowhere in our investigations into the sex industry where Nadine used to work before she was killed, a dancer who knew Nadine has thankfully agreed to speak with me.
I knew her as Samantha and Melissa.
Did she have any regulars or customers that she had that would always come in?
I would not know.
No.
I know that she dealt with drugs, and I knew that she wasn't hurting for money. I know she made good money, so she didn't just go with somebody because she felt she had to. No.
Yeah.
No way.
She didn't have a boyfriend at the time,
No.
or like a significant other?
No,
nothing like that.
Nothing like that.
Okay.
Nothing like that.
And
That I know for sure.
So no pimp, because we
No.
were wondering, like, was she
Not
trying
at
to
all.
get out of it, and
No.
maybe
She
something
didn't have a
happened?
pimp. No way.
No pimp. How did you find out that Nadine was murdered?
I was in the office at my work, and the manager was there and had a picture of her, and I asked, like, why do you have that picture there? And he said, because she was found on the side of the road with her.
I can't believe what she just said. She told me there's a chance that Nadine was mutilated. The autopsy report would verify this information, but we're still trying to access these documents. Who would do such a thing?
The squad and I are bringing fresh eyes to the unsolved murder of Naen Ginski, an exotic dancer dumped by the side of the road in 1999. The squad are going to very quickly find themselves outside of their usual comfort zones. While Monty was looking into trucker and truck stop angles, I had Dania get together with one of Nadine's good friends, and it would seem she may have made a gruesome discovery.
She told me there's a chance that Nadine was mutilated. That just gives me the chills.
I've asked Peter to tabulate a series of potentially related killings in and around the Niagara region. It's clear that we need to be looking for other victims bearing similar injuries so that we can try to find points of comparison to Nadine's killing.
So we see a map of the Hamilton region up on the smartboard here. Now, there have been rumors of a serial killer being active and targeting young women in the Hamilton-Niagara region, but...
Of the 7 women, we've been able to rule out 3, which leaves Dawn Stewart and Felicia Floriani for us to compare to Nadine.
The connections, in my view, are strongest amongst these 3. Here we have the body of Felicia Floriani. It's about 30 kilometers drive from Victoria Avenue and 8th Avenue.
She was fully skeletonized by the time they found her remains. It's difficult to say whether the cause of death is even known.
A few kilometers southeast of where Nadine was discovered is the body of Dawn Stewart. Now, this predates Nadine's case, 3 to 4 years.
What do we know about this case?
Dawn's case is still unsolved, other than the fact that she was also working in the sex trade and found in a ditch. We don't know very many other details to compare the 2 cases.
Here in Niagara Falls, on the other side of St. Catharines, is where Dawn Stewart was last seen.
This is significant because we've got a similar distance covered. Location last seen versus where found.
Yeah.
3 unsolved within a 7-year period. All ditch or floodplain dumps, all in wine country, all female victims. I'm not saying this is the same person, but in Dawn Stewart's case, find out who her family was. The bottom line is we need to find out if she had been similarly mutilated, and if so, is there a potential connection to Nadine's death?
Nadine's death and Dawn Stewart's death both had similarities. They were seen leaving a strip club, and their bodies were dumped in Niagara region ditch. I've tracked down Dawn Stewart's mother, Dorothy, and I'm anxious to find out if there are any connections between the 2 murders. Tell me about Dawn.
Dawn was feisty. She wasn't afraid of anybody. It wasn't uncommon for her to be away. But then that time went on and on and on. It's like she just disappeared off the face of the earth. I ride a motorcycle. During that time, I didn't know that I was going by her body for 6 months.
Let me ask you, Dorothy, do you know how Dawn died?
They said that she wasn't shot and she wasn't stabbed.
What do you think killed Dawn?
I believe that she may have gotten caught up in a drug deal. She may have been killed that way. There was no hands.
Her body was found with no hands.
There was nothing could be proved, nothing. It was like whoever clammed up, and that's the way they are right now.
I can't imagine what it would be like as a mom to have your child come back in pieces and to have died such a terrible death.
This is startling new information. We've now confirmed that 2 women were dumped in the same location, at least one of whom was mutilated, one of whom may have been. We also know that Dawn Stewart was immersed in the local drug subculture. It's time we start looking at more substantive connections between these 2 victims.
Disappointingly, my investigation into the possibility that a trucker may have been involved in Nadine's death didn't pan out. But Dania and I met a new source of information at one of the strip clubs we went to.
Monty and I have been to a handful of strip clubs in Mississauga. One of the girls knew Nadine, and she mentioned the fact that she would leave with pretty much anybody.
Really?
She said to also look into speedy cabs or quick cabs. Dancers were using these cabs and then going missing or murdered.
So they have not spoken to the police before? Nope. Okay, so this is new information. It's a good lead. She got a lot of information that it sounds like the police didn't even get. With the passage of time, people's memories sometimes clear up and their reluctance to speak diminishes, and they'll talk to certain people, not always police investigators. We know that mobility played a key role in Nadine's death. I'm especially interested in what she's telling me about this cab company, offering transportation specifically to the dancers at these clubs where Nadine was working at the time. And that's a direct tie-in.
Yeah, it's Monty. Who do we know from Niagara Falls? Perhaps there was a late relationship with one of the drivers with Nadine that was more than just driver-patron. Who do we know that was in the game in 1999?
Even lawful, legal, properly registered cab companies have regular fares where there's a relationship that develops between the driver and a regular customer.
If you could squeeze it into your schedule today to just take 10 minutes for me. Yeah, I'm going to be right here at this number. I'm not going anywhere. Because they're illegal, unlicensed, there's no criminal background check on any of the drivers. It could be anybody.
Certainly, there would be drivers that would gravitate to certain girls, or conversely, girls who trusted certain drivers.
Maybe one of these guys drove Nadine to her death.
The squad and I are looking into the unsolved 1999 slaying of exotic dancer Naen Ginski, and the information we're uncovering is bringing us deeper into the dark underworld of the strip club circuit. We're finding connections to illegal cab companies, potential connections between long-haul trucking and highway killings, and even organized crime as having potential connections to Nadine's case. We've come as far as we can, so final action items to report in on. Renee?
Well, I reached out to an organization called the Sex Professionals of Canada. They maintain a website that, among other things, publishes a bad date list, which reports from either prostitutes or dancers, men who've enlisted their services and either treated them poorly, sometimes even assaulted or attacked them. They have agreed to publish her photo, details about the case, and a contact number for us.
In this particular case, that may end up being very useful. Monty, what were you able to find out with respect to this unlicensed cab company?
Well, speedy cabs, it turns out, is just a generic term for unlicensed taxis. No insurance, no licensing fee. You don't have to pay the owner. People who drive them tend to do it only for a short period of time. It's mostly out-of-work guys who had wheels. There was no real way to track them. And then there was a big crackdown. Apparently a lot of drugs were being moved around Niagara Falls region using these cabs.
There's also one of the owners that we spoke to at one of the strip clubs, and he mentioned that these cabbies advertise their business by going into the clubs, distributing their business cards to the dancers, to the bar staff, that kind of thing. So that's where they got the influx of all their business.
So unlike a conventional cab where drivers are required to actually attend a police station to have fingerprints taken, background checks are done. We have no real idea who these guys were.
No, it's all underground stuff.
I mean, that remains, as far as I'm concerned, a viable area to investigate. So these illegal taxis ferrying girls around the area, back and forth between Mississauga and the Niagara region, could have played a role. Who did these guys run with? Who did they work for? We have two girls who turn up dead along the same stretch of road. It's definitely starting to look more and more like there may be an organized element, organized crime in particular. We faced an uphill battle in this case from the get-go. Thank you again for all of your diligence and commitment and patience.
By nature of the cases we're taking on, these have all been unsolved for, in this case, something like 14 years. So they've withstood the test of many skilled people. And we can't always provide answers to the family, no matter how much we want to.
The civilian squad has really done a great job with this file, as far as I'm concerned. Everyone has really pitched in and unearthed some new information, or what we call probative facts. Information that can light a fire into this case, give it new momentum, get it moving again, that can be carried forward and used. The squad can take this case no further, and the police have received our research and analysis. As I prepare to address Nadine's family, I wish I had more to give them, but I think they understand the lack of information in this case. I'll start by saying that I can assure you that over the years, Nadine's case was worked very thoroughly. So our thought was, what else can our team of experts offer this investigation? And we deployed people out to the clubs, out on the streets, and a couple of people did ultimately come forward and offered us some information that we're going to have to wait on the autopsy report to confirm. One theory was that given the nature of this road, given the nature of the surrounding area, and given the industry that she was involved in, that we may be dealing with somebody who has a great degree of mobility, such as illegal cab companies, which takes us to our second scenario. Someone in Nadine's life with whom she had some kind of dispute that escalated very quickly. The third scenario is that people who did talk to us made some suggestion, and that this may be something involving organized crime. When we get that autopsy report, it will help us confirm which of the three scenarios is most likely. But that autopsy report will be the missing link. The autopsy report will confirm Nadine's precise cause of death and the state of her body, including the presence of any mutilation. Once we have that information and it's verified, if in fact that's the case, we can look at these injuries perhaps being consistent with either organized crime or this being what's known as a lust killing. A lust killing is a very specific offender mindset that reflects these types of mutilations, if in fact they actually happen. A tip leading us to the right person whose DNA will match the crime scene is what will solve this case. It's our hope that the person holding the key to this will come forward. And that's what this is about.
I really appreciate everyone's help.
Yeah, that's a lot of information.
Yeah, hopefully more than you've received in some time.
Oh, that's more than we've ever heard.
There's a lot of people in your corner.
It gives us, me and Heather, a lot of hope.
I feel it's good to know new information and that people are working this hard to help. It gives me hope.
So thank you for trusting us with this case, and I'm looking forward to what the future brings.
Thank you very much. We really do appreciate everything.
We've given Nadine's family more than they had, which is hope and a fresh set of eyes. And this case doesn't end here. My father was a tireless advocate for the law. He was a criminal prosecutor. Some say ruthless, others say righteous. Yeah, I'm cut from the same cloth. I can't really remember who I was before I became a cop. It's my job to make bad things happen to bad people.
I just thought we were going to have it all.
It haunts me every day. I guess you can only guard them so much in your life.
Something said, she's dead. I started to cry immediately. She didn't deserve to die at such a young age. Somebody needs to pay for it on this earth so I don't have to wait for them to burn in hell.
I still can't believe what happened. It wasn't the kind of end to her life that I thought would ever happen. I thought she'd go on for a long time and be here to look after me.
No matter what you do, you can't make it go away. It won't go away. I call it a broken heart. Somebody brutally murdered her and they didn't pay anything for it.
You see so many happy people out there today, and mothers and daughters and that, and you see and you think, God, why wasn't that them?
Hi, Ray.
Hi, welcome. The picture that I really love, you know, because it's got her whole life there from a child. You could only live your life over again. It just haunts me to think you raised a child from a small baby up to a woman who's there to help preserve life in the hospital. When I see what somebody could do to somebody, I can see it every day, that red welt on her neck.
What do you say to people that have had somebody murdered like that in their lives? They're just so raw, and I can't do anything about it.
I lost my sister, my closest friend. I lost a very big part of me when Trisha was murdered.
My wife said on her deathbed, "Don't ever give up on Trisha." And I said, "No, Flory, I'll never give up, never, never."
Very difficult to fathom how this crime went down and went unsolved for so long. It exerts tremendous pressure on us. We would like to do our part in helping you maintain the promise you made to your wife and to your mother. And with your permission, we would like to take on Trisha's case.
Thank you for that.
Yes, we do thank you for that. Somebody, still to this day, needs to be accountable for what they did to her.
I've been a cop and a professor of criminology for years, and I've used that experience to assemble a squad of civilian subject matter experts. They must approach each case completely unbiased, to not box themselves into conventional thinking, to bring fresh eyes and new technologies to the table. Their job, and mine, is to investigate the coldest of cold cases, the murders that time forgot. Today's case, Trisha Roach. Original file number, 1982, 96306. March 3rd, 1982, Patricia Roach, or Trisha Roach as she was known to her friends and family, 26 years old, recently separated, is home alone in her 2-story brick home at 944 Montclair Avenue. Trisha and her husband were in the midst of separating, have finalized the details. The house has been sold, they're dividing the assets. Around 7:30 p.m., she speaks on the telephone with her new boyfriend. They hang up just before 8 p.m. Her mother had plans to come over and help her that night, to visit with her. Around 9:30 p.m., calls Trisha. She gets no answer. And shortly after midnight, the Hamilton Fire Department gets a call about smoke and flames coming from the house at 944 Montclair. Fire started in the basement, and what they find when the fire is finally put out is the body of Trisha in the basement. A piece of twine is found tightly fastened around her neck. A piece of twine that's consistent with a piece found wrapped around a nearby beam. Cause of death, ligature strangulation by hanging. It was very quickly deemed a suicide. Distressed, divorce pending, house being sold. You know, I'm going to destroy the house and take my own life with it, was the theory at the time. The original investigator, Detective Don Kraft, was persistent in having a second autopsy. And in fact, just prior to Trisha being buried, it was confirmed that this was, in fact, a homicide.
When I look at Trisha, I see a light in her face. I see bright eyes. I see a big smile. And there's just like hope and happiness. To think that her whole light was snuffed out, that it all ended, it's just tragic. It's just unbelievable.
What I want you to do is look at this case with fresh eyes as the investigators found the crime scene. Follow the evidence in this case.
Well, I'm interested to know more about this ligature. How strong was the rope? Could it have borne the weight of her body long enough to cause death?
This was what we call a low hang. A low hang is a variation on a conventional form of hanging oneself, where rather than affixing a rope to something that allows a drop, the subject fastens some kind of ligature to something that's low, a doorknob, and effectively just uses the force of gravity to cut off their air supply. It's commonly seen in institutions, including prisons. Trisha was about 98 pounds. Whether a low hang would work in this circumstance, that's going to be one of the things you're going to have to test through experiments.
Was she depressed?
There's no evidence she was depressed or despondent. We do know that there was a major change afoot in her life.
Was it acrimonious divorce?
The selling of the matrimonial home was done somewhat peacefully.
All assets were separated, so there would have been nothing lingering between any lawyers or that kind of thing. Is that correct?
She was about to move out. The house had been sold. They were dividing the assets, and they were both moving on.
About half of all female murder victims in Canada are killed by a former or current intimate partner, so it'll be important to explore Trisha's relationships.
It's natural in a case like this to jump to the conclusion that an ex-husband, an ex-partner of some kind is responsible. But it's important to not get tunnel vision here. We hear all the time about tunnel vision derailing investigations, and then it's too late to come back to them. Trisha's former spouse had an alibi that was verified. We want the evidence to speak for itself. All right, initial avenues of investigation. Renee, I'm gonna have you start with the preliminary police investigation. Peter, depending on what Renee is able to get from that, I want the two of you to replicate the hanging. And I want to focus specifically on the ligature and the position of the body. What can we learn from these two indicators?
Okay.
Dania, I want you to look at demographic data with respect to suicides among females in the 80s, in and around Trisha's age. And Tanella, I want you to get to the bottom of what was actually going on, not only in Trisha's life, but in her mind. There's so many unknowns in this case. You need to keep your head up and your wits about you. Trisha Roach's case is perplexing. You've got a staged suicide with no sign of forced entry. The house was burned to the ground.
I can't even imagine the hatred this person had towards her.
There's so many layers to this case, such complexity, and such, for lack of a better word, cruelty in its design. I've never seen or heard anything like it. My civilian squad and I are investigating the death of Trisha Roach. When firefighters first responded to reports of flames at her home and found Trisha's body in the basement of the house, the initial assumption is that she had committed suicide. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that Trisha had in fact been murdered. Over 30 years later, we need to start the investigation again from the ground up, and that means my squad looking at Trisha's death the same way investigators back in 1982 looked at it, as a suicide.
I'm meeting with suicide expert Carol Litovsky to see if she can help me understand what compels a person to take their own life, and whether or not the manner of committing suicide in Trisha's case is consistent with how and why females kill themselves, or if it just doesn't make sense. What were the methods that female would use for committing or attempting suicide back then?
Primarily, women have used softer means.
Right.
And hanging in the way that you've described with a fire after, back in the 80s, probably would have been unlikely for a female because it was such a violent means of death. The fact that she was a nurse and had access to medication, that would have, in some respects, been a likelier scenario around a means of death.
Okay. And is it common for a suicidal person to try and cover up their tracks, let's say by starting a fire?
Covering up how you chose to end your life, that's a situation I haven't encountered in my work.
Based on Dr. Litovsky's insight, it seems unlikely that Trisha killed herself. However, other squad members are chasing down the same question, but looking at different angles.
The girl's name was Trisha Roach. I'm just canvassing the neighborhood and see if I can find anyone who knew her. It's just her there. Hey, how you doing? She was a nurse.
I recognize that picture. I was at that scene that evening. Yep, I'm a retired firefighter.
Do you mind if I join you for a moment?
Sit down.
When you got there, what was the situation?
Well, Patricia was hanging in the basement, and a fire had been set.
Did you ever hear any details of the fire, like an accelerant or anything like that, of how it started?
I can't recall that, no.
Have you ever heard anybody talk, or any sort of theories or talk about what actually happened?
I was led to believe that it was a suspicious death right off the bat.
Is that right? There's not too many people around who remember Trisha's death, but of those who do, they all seem to think something was wrong right from the beginning.
I'm meeting with Detective Don Krath, the initial investigator in Trisha's case. I want to find out more about what convinced him that this was not a suicide, and see if he can recall any other details that can help us move this case forward.
Although probably 95 to 99% of hangings are suicides, this one just didn't have the right smell.
So is this fairly consistent with the type of twine that was found around her neck?
Exactly the same type.
What was the nature of the knot?
Just an ordinary type of knot. Anybody could have tied them.
Okay. Can you describe the position that you found her body in?
It was on the basement floor in 2 to 3 inches of water, face down. Her arms were beside her, by her side.
Okay.
And she was below hang.
Was that something that you'd seen before?
I had seen low hangs before, but in almost all the cases, the hands were in the upper position, almost as if he was trying to stop himself from hanging. I never saw anybody with their arms flat.
Do you mind just sketching for me how you found her?
There was a stud here.
I know Monty found a first responder, one of the firemen who attended the scene. It'll be interesting to see if Detective Krath's recollections are similar to his.
There was a 2x4 about 2.5 to 3 feet off the ground. And this is where the knot was.
Okay.
And this is her. She had been suspended up.
I see. Detective Krath's observations certainly seem to point to an elaborate staging of a suicide. Now we'll need to confirm that for ourselves.
Before Trisha and her husband separated, Trisha's father-in-law had started framing in a basement rec room. In the same basement, in fact, where Trisha was found after the fire. I've got Renee meeting with a licensed tradesman to recreate the precise framing job, the schematics in which Trisha was found.
This is the scene that we've reconstructed. We've also got a dummy here to approximate Trisha, just see if it's really possible for her to have put herself into that position and to think about whether this is really possible to be a suicide.
Now, looking at this, the body is prone, face down. This defies everything that I've seen, and I think we know about low hangs or hangs from a seated position. Typically, the body will end up supine or face up because of the way they need to be seated. What we need to do now is apply the ligature and see if this is even physically possible.
So I'm gonna support this up some distance.
The recreation of Trisha's death with the dummy hit home and ripped the heart out of me.
There was a certain amount of slack. It wasn't tight to her neck.
So I'm just going to let it go.
Yeah, just release the weight of the body.
So this approximates the final position in which she was found once the firemen entered the home.
That face down position is also very atypical for a low hang.
In addition to that, we have an additional second problem with the movement of the ligature post-mortem.
So the one through her mouth started in her lips and descended kind of inferiorly as it moved posteriorly. And the first and strongest ligature mark is described further down her neck, and again, its trajectory descends towards the back of the body.
There needs to be an external force acting on that ligature for that to happen. It cannot loosen and then spontaneously refasten itself.
Ligature strangulation, say an attacker from behind the victim, actually results in patterns much like this, where the mark, instead of coursing upward towards some suspension point, ends up going posteriorly and even inferiorly.
The angle of the ligature in itself seems odd. The positioning of the body is equally odd. What is the probability that both of those occurred, coincidentally?
If the intention was a suicide, why pick this?
This is not a low hang. This is a no hang, because it didn't happen.
We've conclusively verified the second autopsy, confirming once and for all that Trisha's death was in fact a homicide. We need to very quickly move forward and determine who would have had cause to do this. Looking at Trisha's case using this avenue, through the lens of the killer who staged this scene to look like a suicide, we're going to learn more about this killer than he had ever intended. My civilian squad and I are examining the 30-year-old murder of Trisha Roach. Now that we've conclusively ruled out that Trisha's death was in any way, shape, or form a suicide, we need to move very quickly to determine who would have had the thought process to stage this crime scene in this fashion.
I'm heading off to meet Dr. Alistair Goodwill. What type of person would commit a murder and have it staged like a suicide?
This is a very specific MO that reflects a very specific offender mindset.
What I'd like to know about the murder is whether or not you think it might have been planned.
They had the clear thought, at least, to try to stage the crime. So this is something that's happened maybe in the heat of the moment, but they've kind of settled down quite quickly after and thought about the situation that they're in and how they're going to deal with it.
I can't imagine how anyone could kill someone, even in the heat of the moment, and then take the time to think through and execute a fake suicide, and then go as far as to light a fire to conceal the crime.
It all depends on that ability to be overcome with anger for a split moment, then calming down quite rapidly after and kind of dealing with the situation.
From what you're saying, it seems like there was 2 stages in this murder. The first one might have been maybe reaction to an argument, and then there was a second step, making it look like a suicide. What does that tell you?
Well, staging is very interesting. We don't see it very often in homicides. What's interesting is the more staging you see, the more evidence of staging, the more likely that the victim knows the offender. I think one thing that they probably thought that the investigators are likely going to look at me as a prime suspect.
I'm going to touch base with Trisha's sister, Kathy, to see who during the final weeks of Trisha's life was she maybe seeing, hanging around, who might have been allowed into her house, someone who was known to her. I also want to ask Kathy about the night Trisha was murdered. Kathy attended the scene shortly after Trisha's death, and I'm wondering if there was anything that was overlooked, anything that she can now recall 30 years later that might help further this investigation. Talk to me about Trisha's relationship with Terry's family during the breakdown of the marriage?
When the split up was taking place, Mike Terry's dad was coming to the house to Trisha and demanding that she pay him for the time he had spent and the work he had put into the basement. He had put up some studs to start some framing, and Trisha refused to pay. On one occasion, Mike let himself into the house because he had a key throughout the marriage and he had a key during the split up. And Trisha was in her kitchen with her back turned, and he was just standing there staring at her without saying a word. And he startled her, he frightened her, and then he spoke and said that he had come by to give her her last chance.
And when was this?
That was approximately 1 week before her murder.
The night of the fire, after you arrived there, did you have a conversation with anyone?
Trisha's neighbor. I remember him saying to me, step inside the house. His daughter heard loud voices, and it was at that point that my husband had said, come on, honey, let's go and stay with your mom and your dad. So I walked away, and I just simply never went back to the man and wished I had.
Do you know where he is or his name?
I don't know his whereabouts, and I never knew the man's name.
That was certainly a revealing meeting. Both of these things, the squad needs to look into further. Antonella, bring it in for a sec. In my follow-up interview with Kathy, Trisha's sister, the night of the fire, the neighbor immediately to the left approached Kathy and said he had something important to tell her. I want to know who owned that house in 1982. I'm tasking Peter and Antonella with digging into old land registry records. What did he want to tell her that was for her ears only? All right?
Sounds good. All right.
I'm about to speak with Dr. Rex Ferris, who was at the scene of Trisha's murder and conducted both postmortem examinations. I'd like to learn more about the specific injuries that Trisha sustained and what that can tell us about the events that took place leading up to her murder. Did you uncover any other injuries during your postmortem examination?
There were injuries to her face.
Okay.
There was bruising on the bridge of her nose and on the inner aspects of both upper eyelids. And then there were also injuries on her wrists. When you get injuries around the wrist on both sides, it's an indication that force has been applied to the wrists, and that usually means restraint.
And the bruising on her face, was there any possibility that it was sustained after she had been hanged?
The presence of bruising on her face occurred before she died. There were deeper injuries, including a fracture at the side of the nose, which clearly indicated that there had to be some form of assault associated with her death.
I later learned that those injuries point to a left-handed killer.
We've got lot numbers, full names, which is good. I've been trying to cross-reference what I can online.
So what I think I'm going to do is call some potential neighbors. I was thinking I'm going to call the Dixons and the Mayers. Maybe they'll be the ones we're looking for.
Go ahead,
Okay?
yeah.
Thanks.
Good luck with that.
Thanks, Peter. I called every Dixon in the book and finally caught a break. I found the neighbors that tried to speak with Trisha's sister the night she was murdered. Only Doreen Dixon is well enough to speak with me. In terms of that night itself, can you tell me what you remember, Doreen?
We went to bed about 10 or 10:30. Next thing I knew, there's a house on fire beside me. All the neighbors were sorry. They had done something to help her. She worked at the General Hospital, and I'd hoped and prayed that she was at work, but she wasn't.
Kathy, Trisha's sister, has wondered for many years what your husband Frank had to say when he called her over. Why do you think he called her over?
I think he wanted to invite her in to keep her warm.
Okay. This happens so many times in these situations. People get so caught up in what they've heard during a time of crisis, and they hold on to it for a very long time, only to discover that in the end, the explanation was quite simple and innocent.
While I was canvassing the bar in the neighborhood where Terry and Trisha lived, bumped into a fella who said he knew them and agreed to speak to me, but privately. Thanks for taking the time. Can you tell me how you knew Terry and Trish? Huh?
I knew him from the high school days. They were very close. They were, of any couples in high school, they seemed like they were real sweethearts.
So can you tell me what kind of guy Terry was? What kind of a person?
He seemed to be very level-headed. I didn't see any strange behavior with him at all.
And when would the last time you would have seen him been? Like, how long ago would that have been?
After the fire and all that. He told me about it briefly, and all he told me was that she was very upset about their marriage breakup, and she, did herself in and they tried to take him with her, make it look like he did it. He just said that's what she did, more or less, like it was a fact.
What I can't quite get my head around is that Terry told an old high school acquaintance that his soon-to-be ex-wife tried to set him up for her murder. Why would you say such a thing? And I'd also really like to know where he was on the night of Trisha's murder.
A civilian squad of subject matter experts and I are examining the 30-year-old murder of Trisha Roach. Her murder was staged to look like a suicide, and for over 30 years, whoever did this has never been caught. Today, psychological profiling and an analysis of Trisha's autopsy report confirmed that whoever murdered her and set her house on fire assaulted Trisha beforehand. I have tracked down Trisha's boyfriend at the time of her death. That's the last person we know she spoke to. That conversation may in fact be key. I'm curious about how does he figure into this bigger picture, into this case. How'd you meet?
We go to a bar, hang out, and she had a nice smile and seemed pleasant and whatever, and she started to talk to me. We just started talking.
During those 5 months, how would you describe the relationship?
I'd never really dated a woman who had been separated before, so it was a little tricky for me, old school Italian. Didn't know how my parents were going to deal with it, but I liked her so much that I pursued.
Did the police ever treat you as a suspect, or?
Oh, yeah. The detectives came to the plant a number of times, and they asked, was there any possible way I could have left during the lunch hour? The circumstances just weren't there. We had a public cafeteria. Everybody went in the cafeteria, and the phone was right on the wall. I was on the phone the whole time.
Do you recall the last thing she said to you before hanging up?
Yeah. Okay, Pumpkin. Goodbye, Pumpkin. We'll see you tomorrow. And I told her that I had to go back, and I would call her and see her in the morning. Give her a shout. And I headed back to work. Next morning, around 6:30, doorbell rang, and there were 2 detectives at my front door. They informed me that she died the night before, that evening. At that point, she had sold her house, and she was pretty happy about it. She was going to move into an apartment because she was excited.
What did she tell you about her ex-husband?
Everything was to herself. She didn't tell me. She didn't tell me. And one night we were there, she peeked through the window, and Terry was outside in his car. So Terry was watching the house.
I'm tasking Monty with locating Terry, Trisha's ex-husband. I'm curious, number 1, if he's locatable, and number 2, if he's willing or amenable to sitting down with us and just discussing what he recalls generally about the circumstances surrounding his wife's murder. If you can find him, reach out to him. Don't ask him any questions about the case, not anything about Trisha per se. See if he's receptive to the idea of sitting down with us. Even though Monty is reaching out to Terry, I'd like Renee to ask the original police investigator on this case, Detective Kraft, some questions about him and any other intimate relationships she had at the time of her murder.
So based on your interaction with the family and the canvass of the neighborhood, and obviously your strong belief that this had been a homicide, did you have any suspects in mind then?
It's usually quite common that who the first person you go after is the husband, the estranged husband, which we did.
Was there anything that allowed you to rule him out?
Terry he was living with a girl. She vouched for him that he hadn't left the house.
My understanding was that Terry's father had done a significant amount of renovation work or was working on the house.
All during the time in which I was investigating. The father had an alibi.
Do you recall what that alibi was?
He was out for dinner. She had to know the person.
Yeah.
She had gone out with an awful lot of fellas. We don't know who all the people that she did know.
So what, in your opinion, is the only way that this case would ever get solved today?
Somebody that provided an alibi at the time where somebody might say, I lied.
Someone has gotten word that we are examining the case of Trisha Roach, and they've sent a letter to me at my office at the university. This is really remarkable, and this is really what this initiative, this Cold Case Society, is all about. The letter's contents are jarring, and this is from somebody who is extremely credible. Antonella, yeah, where are you now? All right, do me a favor and stay there. I'll come to you.
Hey, Mike.
This letter was waiting for me in my office at the university, written anonymously, but there's a name in there, a physician who worked with Trisha. It's a name we haven't heard yet, hasn't come up before. The letter was sent to me to act on, so I'm giving that to Antonella to source some of this information and follow up on these names, specifically this doctor. Show this to nobody else, please.
Thanks. I'll get right on it.
We need to find him stat. The 30-year-old murder of Trisha Roach is one of the toughest that this civilian squad has had to face. These squad members are not professional detectives, but they've already unearthed key information. We know that whoever killed her went to a lot of effort to cover up the crime. Her estranged husband and father-in-law both had alibis. We also found out she was working with a doctor. We need to find out more about him and what he knows. Time is ticking. Suffice it to say, the squad needs to dig deeper. So your timeline?
Yeah, this is consolidated from all our various sources of data.
I've asked Renee to create a visual timeline of all the significant events the night of Trisha's murder. These types of graphic treatments, these visualizations of information, they're often very helpful in terms of establishing new insights.
Because almost all the forensic evidence was destroyed in this case, time of death is impossible to narrow down. Instead, we can only estimate a range of times, and that means an equal range of possibilities.
The other points that kind of overlap with that estimated time of death is when Michael, Terry's father, leaves his dinner and goes back toward Balmoral, where his home is, which is not very far from Trisha's home.
So the question is, did Michael have enough time to get from his daughter's house to his own residence, which is, of course, walking distance to Trisha's house? Terry's father, Michael, reported to police that he was at his daughter's house having dinner and that he left sometime after 9 p.m. During the original investigation, this alibi was considered sufficient to clear him, as authorities thought that this was not enough time for him to drive 10 miles from his daughter's house to his own house, then either drive again or walk to Trisha's house nearby and commit the murder. You know what else occurs to me? I wonder if Michael's own alibi checks out. It was taken at face value back then. I wonder if we test it today, if it holds up.
Trisha's death occurred sometime between 8 and 9:30 p.m. Michael left his daughter's house sometime after 9 p.m., so that would give him at most half an hour to get to Trisha's house and then commit murder. This is the house where Michael claims he had dinner
Okay.
on the night of the murder. He said he went straight home, so let's do the same thing.
And see how long it takes us to get back to Michael's. Let's go for it. The route between Michael's daughter's house in Burlington to Hamilton, where Trisha was murdered, is just over 10 miles, and most of that is highway.
Okay, so here we are. Time it. See where we're at.
Well, we're at 20 minutes and 34 seconds arriving to Mike's house. So we'll time it from here to Trisha's now and see where that's at.
Turn it on.
So the proximity of the two houses,
Exactly, that's why
it's
I
like
think
2 blocks away, not even.
Okay, here we are.
3 minutes and 33 seconds. With just over 20 minutes of driving and 3.5 minutes of walking, Michael's travel time adds up to a little over 24 minutes. His alibi stands up. There's no time left remaining to commit a murder, stage a suicide, and set fire to a house. Looks like we can exclude Michael, Trisha's father-in-law.
I'm going through a report that I obtained from Mike, and this report is really compelling. It gives me information on this male doctor that worked at the hospital where Trisha worked. And I've spoken to some sources at the hospital who tell me that this doctor, he had been violent on a few occasions after his advances had been rebuked. This is somebody that may have some significant information, and we need to investigate him further.
I'm about to meet with Mike. He'd asked me to contact Terry to see if Terry was willing to speak with us.
It's natural in a case like this to jump to the conclusion that a husband is responsible. Terry has an alibi, but we still want to talk to him to see if he has any useful information. So how'd you make out?
Well, we didn't have any luck contacting Terry by phone, but we did manage to find out where he might be on a particular day.
Right.
So we went there, and he was there.
Okay.
We approached him, asked him if he'd be willing to have a chat with us about what happened of the incident, and he said no.
So even though this initiative might help reopen this case, you want something to do with it, he was definitive about that in your mind?
He was perfectly clear that he doesn't want to talk to us, period.
It's unfortunate that Terry has declined our offer to meet and to go over the facts in this case. But when you re-explore a cold case this many years later, there's bound to be obstacles. Being reluctant to speak about a case, being circumspect, as we say, is not necessarily indicative of guilt or complicity or involvement at all, and sometimes it's simply a matter of someone just not wanting to dredge up the past. The civilian squad of subject matter experts and I have been pushing hard for answers into the unsolved murder of Trisha Roach. And we're left with two people who may hold vital information that can help us out, information that could blow this case wide open. One is Trisha's ex-husband, who has declined to speak with us, and the other is a doctor who worked with Trisha at the time of her death. So I've tasked Antonella with finding out where he is now and what he was doing the night of Trisha's murder.
I'm going through a report that I obtained from Mike. There's information on this male doctor that worked at the hospital where Trisha worked. And this doctor left soon after Trisha's murder, and his whereabouts have not been confirmed, but we know he's not in Canada.
I'm going to keep trying to track him down and hopefully get some answers.
All right, there's a few final tasks for people to report in on. Renee, how'd you make out in terms of analyzing Trisha's injuries and the pathologist's report?
Trisha's injuries were not symmetrical, either to her face or to her wrists. The sides that you see these injuries on suggest to me that we're looking at someone who punched her with their left hand, likely while using their right hand to grip the left arm very tightly.
In the general population, left-handedness is statistically rare. Peter, what do you got?
This slide shows Bayes' rule, and it deals in odds. Given the strong evidence that Trisha's killer was left-handed, this case is already an ideal candidate for analysis through Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem is a statistical method designed to determine the probability of an unusual event occurring. I've constructed an imaginary situation where a woman who was in a relationship has been found murdered. The core question that Bayes' theorem will answer is not who killed Trisha, but how likely is it that Trisha's killer was left-handed and a stranger, or left-handed and known to Trisha. And so the odds that someone Trisha knew committed this crime turned out to be about 117, 118 to 1. Now, we haven't factored in the left-handedness yet. We're looking at 10 times fewer possible people who could have done this, because 1 in 10 people is left-handed. These odds turn out to be about 1,177 to 1.
So that fraction translated into percentage is 99.92% likelihood is what you're saying.
That's right.
There's a strong indication that whoever killed Trisha was left-handed and knew her intimately. We're turning this information, these findings, over to the police with all of our research and analysis. It's up to them to take this case to the next level. So thanks for coming. If I can turn your mind back to, Kathy, when I met with you, one of the things you mentioned that's nagged at you for over 30 years was the night of the fire, the next door neighbor approached you and indicated that he had something to tell you. And would it have ever made a difference? I wanted to let you know that at the end of the day, he didn't have anything overly important to say, but that he offered his support. That stuck with her for over 30 years. At least now, she can finally let go of her guilt about not pursuing this information at the time of her sister's death. One of the first things we wanted to look at was alibis. The former father-in-law, Michael, there was always the question, did he have enough time based on when they assumed he arrived home? So we followed the same route, and based on other neighbors' accounts of smelling smoke, the average time Mike would have had to commit this crime would have been 6 minutes. So while it is possible, it's unlikely. But we're concerned foremost with who assaulted her and who ultimately murdered her. There's no sign of forced entry in this case, no robbery, no sexual assault, none of the actions one would typically associate with a confrontation with a stranger, a random attack. Trisha's murder is a very singular crime. There's a lot of information we have at our disposal today whereby we can determine probability of somebody committing this crime. The pathologist's report clearly indicates an offender who is left-hand dominant. The statistical improbability of someone being attacked in their own home by a left-handed person while in a relationship, that translates to a 99.92% chance that person with whom she was in an intimate relationship, that had access, that had earned her trust, murdered Trisha. It is now in the hands of the police to find out who in her small, intimate circle was left-handed. They're also going to need a tip, a retraction, or a confession to move forward.
Is it your belief that this would have been a premeditated murder?
If this was premeditated, planned out exhaustively, it would have been done with more convincing detail. To me, this looks like a situation that very quickly escalated, and then we have this staging that happens after.
When you hear this, how does it make you feel?
I mean, I can't look at her picture or barely say her name, usually without being brought to tears. I guess a big part of that is because nobody ever was held accountable. So I'm really praying every night and hoping that this brings accountability to Trisha's murder and maybe some rest in peace, because I truly don't believe she's rested in peace.
My father was a tireless advocate for the law. He was a criminal prosecutor. Some say ruthless, others say righteous. Yeah, cut from the same cloth. I can't really remember who I was before I became a cop. It's my job to make bad things happen to bad people.
Wasn't like Grampy to just up and disappear. It's a hard thing to think that somebody would do that to someone else. When you're being beat and you're that age, you don't stand much of a chance. There were so many things that just didn't make sense.
A Metro Toronto police officer was following up on a tip from a bylaw officer who had tagged a van. Further investigation revealed the body of an elderly man inside.
I got a call from my mother. She told me that Grampy was missing. For those 9 days, we had no idea what was going on. That waiting time, that I think was the worst. I remember Mom getting quite upset, and she started to cry. She kind of knew. It just didn't make sense.
And this is where they say that Daddy was murdered.
They took his body out as soon as they could. There could have been a lot more. Memories made. Why hasn't somebody been brought to justice for murdering Grampy?
The circumstances surrounding Clyde's murder are bizarre.
Obviously, you have some wonderful memories of your grandfather and your father. What has it been like for you to have him taken away so brutally?
It would have been nice to have him come home and...
Dad was a very soft-hearted person, and he'd do anything for anyone.
He would be the last person you would ever expect to end up this way.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Home was his sanctuary. He started out with nothing. He was a self-made man, and that at the end of his life, during his golden years when he's supposed to be enjoying the fruits of his labor, someone invades that space. If you can't feel safe in your own home, where can you feel safe? If push came to shove, get physical, if someone tried to back him into a corner.
I've never seen it, but...
I've never seen it, but I know he would. He would have put up a fight, yeah.
So what we would like is your blessing to take this case on, and I think it could benefit from some fresh eyes.
I'm agreeable.
Yes, very agreeable.
I've been a cop and a professor of criminology for years, and I've used that experience to assemble a squad of civilian subject matter experts. They must approach each case completely unbiased, to not box themselves into conventional thinking, to bring fresh eyes and new technologies to the table. Their job, and mine, is to investigate the coldest of cold cases, the murders that time forgot. Case number 99-510-291. Clyde Orlando Frost. Facts are as follows. On the evening of January 23rd, 1999, sometime after 11:30 p.m., 80-year-old Clyde Frost disappears from his middle-class home in the city of Hamilton. The next day, his wife, Gillette, arrives home at approximately 3 a.m. from a late-night flight from Jamaica, where she was visiting her ailing father, and by her account proceeds directly to bed in a separate bedroom. She wakes up sometime in the late morning and discovers that Clyde is missing. His 1995 Dodge conversion van is not in the driveway. She finds this suspicious and reports him missing to police. January 27th, 1999, Hamilton police execute a search warrant at the Frost home and discover a stain on the basement carpet that is ultimately determined to be the blood of Clyde Frost, which, by the way, was caused by blunt force trauma to the head.
'Cause I was 16 when I met him. 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 '
February 2nd, 1999. A Toronto bylaw enforcement officer discovers a stack of parking tickets on the windshield of what seems to be an abandoned conversion van in the city's Regent Park neighborhood. Upon looking in the windows, the bylaw enforcement officer finds a body in the back, a body determined to be that of Clyde Frost. Within 24 hours of Clyde's body being found, police receive an anonymous fax from an author the police describe as having intimate knowledge of Clyde's murder. In the fax, the author describes Clyde's death as having resulted from a ransom kidnapping scheme gone bad. 3 men somehow gained access to his home while he was there, but there's no sign of forced entry. A redacted copy of this fax was released to the public, which, as you can see, is signed "Sincerely, Stupid, and Sorry." The police will frequently suppress information that only the killer or killers would know, what we call holdback information, information that's not publicized and not even widely known outside of an inner circle of lead investigators. And here we are 15 years later, this case still unsolved, still cold. As it turns out, Clyde Frost was worth a fair bit of money. He was a retired long-haul truck driver turned landlord, and he had amassed a small fortune. Aside from the facts making reference to the ransom scheme, at no point was a ransom demand ever made to the family. Which brings us to the next question. Who knew about this small fortune that he had accessible?
Recently married. I'm looking at the financial situation.
She certainly has an ironclad alibi.
Did anyone else live in the house with Clyde and Gillette?
Gillette's mother lived in the home, as did her 2 teenage children from a previous relationship. Now, we know that the night Clyde disappeared, Gillette's son was away at a sleepover, but her 16-year-old daughter was home, as was Gillette's mother.
Sometime after 11:30 p.m., Clyde let 3 men into the home. Why would you do that unless you knew them? How is it that the grandmother and the daughter never heard 3 men in the home?
Pretty high risk to enter when people are home.
It is.
Well, to remove the body, no less, not even just to leave him in the basement. As a society, we should be respecting our elders and looking up to them. And for him to have been taken advantage of in such a horrific way is very troubling.
When I saw Clyde's picture, I see a vulnerability. I can empathize with the family on what they went through and how they were feeling.
I've seen it many times. Money destroy relationships. It can destroy marriages.
It's time for fresh eyes, new perspectives, new ideas.
I think I want to start with the neighbors and the tenants.
Were any of them disgruntled? Had he recently evicted anybody? Being a landlord is a tough business. Antonella?
I'd like to find out more about Clyde and Gillette's relationship.
What were the dynamics of their relationship?
The fact that he was newly married to a much younger woman, we have to be careful not to make too many assumptions and look at everybody equally.
Dania, what do you got?
I want to look at the facts itself. A linguistic expert might tell us more about the perpetrator, perpetrators.
Renee?
I think we need to learn more about the exact circumstances of Clyde's death. So I'm going to look at the basement. There may be some new forensic techniques that we can use to identify the original bloodstain, any other bloodstain patterns on the walls that could describe the attack that took place.
I do like where you're going in terms of looking at the crime scene, assuming the home was the murder site. It will allow us to either validate some of the evidence that's in that fax or discredit it as simply a made-up story. Peter, lastly, you?
I'm very interested to see if I can pull out journalistic records of any similar crimes.
In terms of victimology, elderly male victims who are killed by strangers, we're talking a very, very small percentage. Do not operate with any preconceived notions or expectations. Come at this using your own expertise, your own experience, and your own insights. This case, for all intents and purposes, starts now. Motive, to me, in this case, is interesting. On the surface, seems to clearly be about money. Who wanted it most, and what steps were they prepared to go to get it? And if they were denied it, what would they do in retaliation? And we know what they did is they killed them. The squad of civilian subject matter experts and I are undertaking with fresh eyes an analysis of the 1999 slaying of 80-year-old Clyde Frost, who was murdered in his home in Hamilton, Ontario. We know this crime was all about the money. The question is how much money? Are we talking hundreds, thousands, or hundreds of thousands, up to the $1 million or so Clyde was worth at the end of his life? From the outset, we need to jump in and have a retrospective look at Clyde's business dealings, his intimate relationships, his relationships with his tenants, and the facts behind this purported kidnapping. I've tasked Dania to track down Gillette. The internet and phone books have yielded nothing, so she needs to be creative.
I want to find Gillette because she might have some useful information. She knew Clyde. She was Clyde's wife. I'm going to the African hair and beauty supply shop in Hamilton, as we know that Gillette was really into her personal appearance, so we thought it was the most logical place to start. I was actually looking for a woman named Gillette. She used to live in Hamilton around 1998, 1999.
No, she doesn't look familiar.
Hi.
What can I do for you?
We're looking for a woman by the name of Gillette. Does that ring a bell?
Nope.
Her husband was actually murdered back in 1999. He would have been about 79 years old at the time. She was in her 40s.
I know who you're talking about.
Do you really?
I actually do.
When was the last time that you saw Gillette?
I would say what, maybe 7, 8 years, maybe longer.
What else do you know about the case?
I know there has been a lot of talk among the community as to maybe he was killed and who would want him dead.
Did they say who?
No, I never heard anything about who it might be.
We found somebody who actually knew her, which is really exciting. So fingers crossed moving forward.
I'm going to meet Charles Eleveld. He worked for Clyde Frost, did evictions for him. How are you? Monty. I'm well. What kind of guy was Mr. Frost? What kind of a man was he?
Mr. Frost really was a nice guy, and he would help anybody that needed help.
I see. So you feel people took advantage of Mr. Frost?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Did Mr. Frost collect the rent himself?
Yeah, he did. He would go out on a Saturday and collect the rent. Many times he would have probably $2,000 or $3,000 worth of cash in his pocket.
Because of the way Clyde operated and dealt in cash and carried cash, anyone who knew that information would be worth having a quick look at. So as I go through the documents here, I'm seeing this one particular set of tenants. Were they evicted eventually, or?
Yes, they were.
Do you think they would have held a grudge against Mr. Frost because of this eviction?
No doubt about it.
Now, I see another tenant here. Was there an eviction here?
There was also an eviction. She was a stripper, and she was involved with the motorcycle club. I was kind of worried about it, especially when I was alone, and there were 3 or 4 of them.
So, Charles, in your opinion, do you think it's possible that an ex-tenant could be responsible for his death?
There were at least some people were interested in getting rid of Clyde Frost.
So now I've got to track down some of Clyde's former tenants, see if any persons of interest show up.
Peter's task was to look for similar crimes in and around the time period where Clyde Frost was kidnapped and murdered.
First of all, what we have here is the Frost case, where he was last seen in his home and where he ended up. All right. And here's the new case that I found, Bill Staples.
67-year-old William Staples was found in the rear of Staples' pickup truck.
Almost 1 year to the day prior to the disappearance of Frost, Bill Staples disappeared from his Binbrook home. About 6 months later, he was found in the back of his own GMC Sonoma pickup.
What am I looking at here?
Well, I've listed the similarities, and there are quite a few.
Bill Staples, wealthy retiree, attacked in his own home January '98, murdered, driven in his own vehicle where he's left. Clyde Frost, a year later, wealthy retiree, also attacked in his own home and driven alone in his own vehicle long distance away, vehicle abandoned on a city street. Both died from blunt force trauma to the head. This is pretty compelling. There seems to be some obvious points in common. I'd be interested to know what the status of this investigation is.
Well, it's been unsolved for 10 years and more, and no one's been convicted as of yet.
criminology, we have something called general deterrence theory. People will be dissuaded, deterred from committing crimes if there is a certainty of punishment. Conversely, when crimes of a sensational nature go unsolved, people are getting away with it. People who have half-baked ideas about committing crimes themselves see that there is no consequence. What we can't rule out is the copycat effect. You have to question the publicity surrounding this Staples case, whether or not piqued somebody else's curiosity in trying such a scheme. So we have a few leads to follow up on. This Staples case, on the surface, seems to have a matching MO to Clyde's case. That merits looking into further. Equally, I'm wondering if any of Clyde's tenants had enough of a grudge to go after his money or to kill him. Squad and I are examining the 15-year-old cold case of Clyde Frost, an 80-year-old man who was murdered in his own home, possibly for money, and then dumped over 100 kilometers away in his own vehicle. Despite their lack of direct field experience in this type of work, I'm already impressed with the squad's diligence and their findings. Peter, for instance, has uncovered some disturbing similarities between Clyde's murder and another Hamilton murder just 1 year prior. Beyond that, Monty's also been able to track down some of Clyde's former tenants, many of whom were in arrears on their payments. Could this have been a motive?
My name is Doug Montgomery. Just trying to get a feel for what kind of landlord was he.
Personally, I'm sorry, I thought he was a slime ball. 3 months after his wife dies, he's looking for somebody to replace her.
So he was difficult to get along with in some ways?
No, as far as our business, we got behind our rent.
Right.
We really went through a couple of years of hard times. There was no talk of him throwing us out or anything. He worked with us. In that sense, he was a good person.
Right. Quite honestly, I don't think this couple owed him enough money for things to get that carried away. Pretty certain I can rule her out. Well, that was a bit of a strikeout. It turns out that Clyde actually helped this tenant when times were tough. So now I've got to check out any other tenants with red flags, see what they have to say.
Detectives had discovered extensive bloodstains inside the family home that 80-year-old Clyde Frost once called home.
Before police could arrive at the scene and confirm that it was Clyde's blood, his family had cleaned the stain, telling police that it thought it was juice. I'm going to the scene where Clyde Frost was murdered with Wade Knapp. He's an expert in analyzing crime scenes and has years of experience using alternate light sources and chemical tests to detect and analyze blood. So Wade, this is the basement where Clyde Frost was murdered. The police later searched the basement and there was a report of a large blood stain pretty close to where we're standing here at the base of the stairs. I'm hoping to find residue of the blood stain. Depending on the pattern of blood, you might be able to reconstruct more about what happened to Clyde. Was he already on the ground when he was struck, producing one single pool of blood? Is there blood spatter on the wall that indicates movement between Clyde and the perpetrators? This will help us verify the details that were included in the fax that was sent.
When a suspect is cleaning up after themselves to try and avoid detection, they don't realize how sensitive some of the investigative tools are that we have. So if they can't see that blood, for instance, visible after they've cleaned it up, they assume that there's no trace of it left, and that's just simply not the case.
If the materials that absorbed the blood in Clyde's case are still in this house today, we will be able to identify where that bloodstain initially was. We use a specific wavelength of light with orange goggles to filter, and that will reveal any traces of bloodstain. Wade, what do you think about this dark spot here? A stain of some kind.
It might be worth investigating. We're going to use an indicator known as hexagon OBTI.
So in this case, we've only got one line in the window at C. Although we've identified a stain with the light source, it's not human blood.
Correct.
I was very disappointed that our experimentation in the house today did not reveal any of Clyde's blood. I was hoping that those details might support or refute the details that were written in the fax that was sent by the alleged perpetrators.
The other avenue of investigation the squad needs to follow up on is tracking down Gillette and her family. See what they know about the final few hours of Clyde's life. And while we know that Gillette was out of the country when Clyde was murdered, we also know that her mother and her daughter were at home in the same residence where Clyde was murdered, either at the time or immediately thereafter. So where are we at in terms of either finding or talking to Gillette or her family?
I've been trying to get in touch with her sons. So we sent a letter to them. They were delivered, they were received. There's been no response.
Interesting. Antonella?
I was able to talk to Gillette's daughter, Roseanne.
Okay. Roseanne's version of events is key. She was the one who cleaned up what was later determined to be Clyde's blood in the basement, thinking it was grape juice. The question is, was this an honest mistake, or did someone counsel her to destroy evidence?
She was quite disturbed by my call, and I think shaken as well, but she doesn't want to have anything to do with talking to us. It was something she completely discounted, so that would make me think there's a place she doesn't want to go to. As she told me, the assumption was made that because they were Black, they might have had something to do with the murder. What if there's fear involved? What if they had nothing to do with it, but somehow know who did?
I'm curious why, when presented with an opportunity by an impartial group of experts, why she wouldn't seize that opportunity to come clean with what she knows. Tell the story that she says no one wanted to listen to almost 15 years ago. Well, here's your chance. So why aren't you taking it? Antonella, I'm going to task you of calling her and passing a definitive message on to Gillette about what we're doing and seeing if she wants to speak to us. So I don't want to say that it's mission impossible, but it's mission improbable. And if there's anyone who can convince Gillette to come on board, my guess is it's Antonella.
If you want to get your story out, why wouldn't you speak to us? Because we want to listen. We want to solve this.
Does someone have a hold over Gillette and her family even to this day? Is someone dissuading them from cooperating? Do they have any connections to Clyde's business dealings? These are precisely the types of questions we need to answer. The civilian squad and I are investigating the cold case of 80-year-old Clyde Frost, a Hamilton landlord most likely murdered for money and left in his own van. Monty has excluded as many of Clyde's problem tenants that he's been able to track down, so now he's widening his search into Clyde's other business dealings, looking for persons of interest. Also, we've been trying to verify a partially censored facsimile that claims that Clyde's death happened because of a kidnapping gone wrong. Antonella has also tracked down Clyde's widow, Gillette, asking her to speak with us, but she's declined. Does she have some knowledge of what happened that night, and is someone pressuring her to keep quiet?
I'm calling to see if I could get some information on a lawyer to try and track him down. I'm trying to contact a lawyer that worked for Clyde. Charles, Clyde's eviction officer, told me that this lawyer had persuaded Clyde to invest in a building, and he feels there may have been ill will between the two parties after this deal was done. I'm doing some research on Clyde Frost, and I was wondering if you were the lawyer that worked with him in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada in the 80s and 90s. Okay, well, sorry to have bothered you. Bye-bye. There's a lot left to do on the theory that someone who held a grudge against Clyde killed him. We just have to keep looking into it.
In the case of Clyde Frost, Peter was tasked with finding commonalities between Clyde's murder and the earlier murder of William Staples. Whoever murdered Clyde Frost may have been not only looking to emulate what happened in the Staples case, but also mask their crime to fit the MO of the Staples case.
In 1999, there was no named suspect. In 2010, there was an arrest, and the case is still being tried. We now know enough to rule out any connection to Clyde's case.
We've hit a wall on this. There's nowhere else to go with the Staples case.
As investigators, we're taking unconventional approaches, so we're bound to get some false positives or some red herrings.
All right, I'll check back
for the
soon.
info.
You bet. Antonella has come up against nothing but brick walls in her search for Clyde's widow and her daughter, who we know was in the house either at the time or immediately after Clyde was murdered. While that's disappointing, there's a witness, a resident from the neighborhood, who has come forward and has some information he wants to share.
Mr. Frost, of course, lived here.
Alan Ford was a neighbor of Clyde's. He lived right next door. Actually, his bedroom window faced into Clyde's driveway. What I hope to find out from Alan is what he saw that day of Clyde's murder and anything else he thinks might be relevant in our investigation. So, Alan, tell me about the day of the murder.
There was some activity around Clyde's van. There were at least 3 people moving around the van at that time, none that I would recognize.
Can you describe them to me at all?
The one fellow had a hat on, and it looked like the back van door was open and that they were making plans to put something in it. I kind of hope that this brings some resolution to Clyde's family. He deserved better than what had happened.
What do you think happened to Clyde?
I was pretty shaken by it. I'm going to leave it at that.
Meeting the people that knew Clyde, you can see there's a lot of collateral damage. Alan did corroborate there were people hanging around Clyde's van the day after his murder. Could they be connected to the Regent Park area of Toronto?
Where his body was found, in this van.
And could it be people that the family knew?
I'm going to meet with Ron Reetham, who's a retired member of the Toronto Police. He worked in Regent Park area extensively over his career, and he was also on the scene the day that Clyde's body was found.
He has detailed insights into not only the crime scene itself, but the surrounding neighborhood.
We can safely say that the van was parked right outside that window right there.
Take me through maybe the mindset of whoever decided to deposit this van on, to dump Clyde Frost's body on. Why this street, why this neighborhood?
Did the person that was driving that van, did he not really know the area, panicking, just came up here and dumped it?
Maybe it had nothing to do with the neighborhood and it was just a matter of logistics.
Would you expect a killer to leave a body kind of in their own backyard or so close to home?
Not usually from my experience. To be from Regent Park, go to Hamilton and commit a murder and then bring the body back here with you, you know, anything's possible.
Not only did they deposit the body here, but then they make reference to this neighborhood by name in the facts subsequently sent to the police. The question now is what that fax has to do with why the body was left here.
Kind of looks like it's been written by somebody that knows what they're talking about. Well, it looks to me like these 2 kids, if you will, were hired to do something.
That's your hunch?
That's, I mean, just from reading that, it looks to me like there was a bad debt, and these 2 were sent to help get that debt.
And it went bad.
And it went bad.
One question you can't help but ask when you see a home invasion gone bad, especially really bad, as in Clyde's case, is whether Clyde had some financial problems that few people knew about, or if he was somehow connected to somebody who had their own financial problems and he was put in the middle. Either way, the squad needs to dig deeper, and these questions merit looking into. The civilian squad of subject matter experts and I are looking into the cold case of 80-year-old Clyde Frost, a well-off Hamilton landlord probably murdered for money and left in his own van. Through the squad's work, we have learned that a facsimile sent by the perpetrators indicates that Clyde's murder likely resulted from a kidnapping gone wrong. One of the original investigators on the case thought that maybe somebody was calling in a bad debt or robbing Clyde simply to pay back a bad debt. Clyde's widow, Gillette, and her family have declined to speak with us, and there are many unanswered questions that still linger. Is this family still in fear of the killers? Who may have owed money? Was it Clyde, or was it somebody else?
Daniel requested documents from the courthouse on Clyde Frost's will and any other information surrounding this case. Gillette Anesta Frost, she was named sole beneficiary and trustee.
Okay, let's take a look at this indictment here. So what I'm seeing is that Gillette paid restitution for welfare fraud.
Oh, really?
She got, it says 6 months imprisonment, but she served 16 days, and she had to do community hours. Oh, she had house arrest too. Wow.
This casts Clyde's widow Gillette in a different light. These documents reveal she did prison time for welfare fraud and had significant gambling debts.
She was told to get counseling and treatment and go to Gamblers Anonymous.
She had gambling debts in excess of $100,000, and the question here is, where'd she get that money, right? Could there be a connection between the person or people who murdered Clyde and whoever sent that facsimile to the police, admitting that this was a botched kidnapping? Or is there a chance that they were collecting on a bad debt owed by Gillette?
This is information I need to get to the squad right away.
I'm calling the Frost family to ask them about their insights into Gillette and Clyde's marriage. What kind of relationship did your grandfather have with Gillette?
He seemed like he wanted more, maybe more attention, and he wanted to be more like closer to her than what she seemed to want to be to him.
How did Gillette and your grandfather father meet?
She used to rent from my father.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they met.
Did she ever mention anything about their relationship in terms of intimacy?
He said he should get an annulment. And I said, well, if you aren't happy, I said, maybe you should.
Before he was married, who were the beneficiaries in the will?
That would be myself and my sister Diane and my sister Virginia.
And after the marriage?
Gillette.
After speaking with the Frost family, it's obvious that they were concerned about Gillette and Clyde's relationship. They didn't think he was very happy. He had concerns.
People need to lean this out and figure out what exactly this information is telling us. And it's telling me, find Gillette and find out what her story is. Then you follow me to the smartboard if you could. Despite what we're learning about Gillette, it's important to not get boxed into a theory and to explore all avenues of investigation open to us. There's still the lingering question about that bizarre facsimile sent to police. There's no doubt that contained in that document are some key answers. So one thing that's been nagging at me is this bizarre facsimile. Seems to me that this is a really rich source of evidence. The narrative in this facsimile lays out a scenario where 3 individuals attended Clyde Frost's home. The intent is to kidnap him and extort his family for $500,000. They seem to be satisfied with the fact that Clyde had $5,000 in his wallet and they were prepared to leave with that. Clyde then tells them he has more money in the basement and he lures these 3 into the basement. But presumably Clyde is looking to either detain these men or otherwise subdue them for the authorities. And the author describes he and the accomplice known as B as trying to hold back or restrain C, who it reads like delivered the fatal blow and actually murdered Clyde. These redactions, as we call them, these censor marks where everything's been blacked out, this makes it very difficult to genuinely analyze this document using forensic linguistics. It doesn't rule out psychological analysis. I've got someone in mind I'd like you and Renee to meet with.
Danny and I are going to be interviewing Jim Van Allen. He has decades of experience working with the provincial police to try and really piece together what is the mindset of the perpetrator. What can we learn based on what was written in the facts and how that compares to the details of the crime itself?
Even though a lot of the information is blacked out on the facts, Jim can help us decipher the actual contents that we can see. Do you think this was a kidnapping gone wrong?
I don't really believe it was a kidnapping gone wrong. I believe that the victim was targeted. The staged kidnapping is an intent to deflect suspicion away from the people that are involved in. In the wording of the letter, it sort of says, we were going to ask for a ransom, but then as the letter progresses, it says this isn't something we decided until later. It seems to be written with a number of choices, and even their emotions are undecided, I think, as indicated by the question marks that appear throughout the letter. And a stranger would not move that body. They would have no need to move that body. The offender would choose to move the body because they fear that they can be associated to either the victim or the location that the crime happened. There could be the involvement of female authorship as well.
Why do you say that?
We see differences in letters and emails written by men and women. Women tend to include emotional terms. It tends to be more conversational, and that's some of the features that I see in this letter.
Are there any red flags that, based on your years of experience, are raised?
One of the other things I noticed in the letter as well was where the authors are suggesting that somebody is willing to confess and then likely serve a sentence and then leave the country, suggests the possibility that one of the offenders might be foreign born. I would categorize this case as a staged kidnapping of an elderly targeted victim for a profit motivation and a subsequent cover-up by people who were somehow acquainted or associated with the victim.
What kind of hit home was the fact that he said that the person or the culprits was associated with Clyde in some respect. Our squad has repeatedly tried to contact the family members, trying to get their perspective of the story, and the lack of cooperation, the cleaning up of the blood, those kind of things just are not consistent with a family, a grieving family who's just dealt with losing a loved one.
In investigating the 1999 murder of wealthy senior Clyde Frost, the civilian squad of non-professional detectives has learned that the killers were possibly connected to the victim. Money was the motive, whether calling in a bad debt, a botched robbery, or attempting a kidnapping when things went out of control and Clyde was killed. There's one loose end remaining, that Clyde's death was the result of a grudge born from a business deal gone wrong. I've tasked Monty with following that up.
Charles Eleveld, Clyde's eviction officer, told me about Cass, Clyde's former lawyer, and I finally found him. I want to see what he has to say about Clyde's business affairs at the time. I had a few questions for you about Clyde Frost. Do you remember when you first met him?
It was probably in the 60s or 70s. He became a client of mine in connection with real estate transactions.
And can you remember when the last deal you were involved with him was?
It had to be before 1979.
Before 79?
Because I stopped practicing law in 1979.
Fantastic.
Because I got into trouble myself.
Well, when you stopped practicing law?
I was charged with fraud and theft, and I served a 6-year sentence.
Just the way Henry came across, with absolutely nothing to hide. I don't know how Charles got the idea that Clyde and Henry had difficulty, especially since we can't find any evidence of the two men doing any business post-1979. Perhaps Charles just feels so badly about what happened to his old friend that maybe he's looking for something that wasn't there. I think we do that sometimes.
The 1999 murder of Clyde Frost. A lot of roadblocks, a lot of impediments during the course of our investigative analysis. But we did make some headway. So, Monty, I'm going to go to you first. People like to speculate about the theory that Clyde had left a trail of angry tenants in his wake and maybe one of them held a grudge.
I exhausted, just about every avenue. I don't think there's any merit to that idea, that theory. He would actually let tenants stay on when they were unable to pay rent and let them pay as they were able.
Peter, over to you.
So I delved into geospatial statistics for violent crimes in Hamilton, specifically homicides and break-and-enters. It turns out that the San Pedro area of Hamilton is one of the safest and most affluent in the city.
So this isn't bleed over from neighborhood turf wars or part of a larger pattern of home invasion break-and-enters. This is really an anomaly. Antonella?
After many phone calls, emails, social media, and letters sent by courier, we were unable to get information interviews from Clyde's inner circle, which include his widow, his 2 stepchildren that lived in the house.
Basically a strikeout. Renee?
The culprits are most likely associated with either the address or Clyde's family, or possibly both. We also know that the person who wrote the fax was a woman. This crime was not perpetrated by a stranger.
No question that Clyde Frost was specifically targeted. The question then is, how much money? Whether whoever did this was after the full estate, this $1 million or so in assets and properties, or just the cash in Clyde's hand. That's the one thing at this point we cannot answer, is what was Clyde's life worth to whoever did this? We've got something here to turn over to the authorities. We certainly have something to turn over to Clyde's family, who's been waiting for answers now for over 10 years.
This case was purely about greed, whoever did this.
Given the degree of physical evidence that should have been present both in Clyde's basement and in his van, it's very frustrating that no one was ever charged or caught for the murder of Clyde Frost.
The squad can take this case no further, and the police have received our research and analysis. So, after re-examining Clyde's case, there was no evidence to suggest that his death was committed at the hands of any of his tenants, anyone he knew through his business dealings. All evidence points to the fact that whoever did this is affiliated with the family that was living in that house. And again, this goes back to the truthfulness of that facsimile, and we recruited some outside experts to look at that fax. And the general consensus is whoever authored that, if they weren't directly involved, have direct, intimate knowledge of what happened. And I don't think they were prepared for an 80-year-old man being as tough as he was, and things escalated very quickly.
Right.
And one of them took the extra step of murdering him.
I think that person should come clean, because for one thing, it's got to be weighing heavily on the conscience. We get some relief ourselves, and you know, we'd like to see justice done for Grampy. He deserves that.
My guess is whoever wrote that would still want to come clean about that. And at this point, re-releasing that facsimile that they wrote in an unredacted form is the best way to reignite that sense of guilt that was gnawing on their conscience during those early days.
I feel that this person that sent the fax, if they felt that guilty, then they must have been maybe close to him.
Thank you for allowing us to explore this case further. I'm confident this case remains more solvable than ever. Therefore, our report going forward to the police will reflect the fact that this case should be reopened, and should be reopened with the view that a narrowed pool of suspects should include people immediately known to Clyde, and that distills this down to a very small group of people. You've been very brave, and we need more people like you who are prepared to do this if we're going to get these cases solved, these older cases in particular. So thanks again.